Of course, I'd like to address that, and thank you for this invitation. A specific thanks to Marco and Letizia Moratti. It was a real pleasure for me to accept your invitation to come here. It's such a pleasure to come to San Petrignano every time. Last summer I had a chance to come on a Saturday. It was a gorgeous day. My wife and my son came with me, and we have wonderful memory of that day. Now, to answer your question, without a doubt, the world of finance has really endeavored to give itself the worst possible reputation. In fact, we've come up with all kinds of hair-brand ideas, bubbles, scandals, value destruction, every single thing you could possibly think of. In that context, revamping the way that finance looks or what its reputation is something that needs to be done. We might actually even be behind schedule compared to other sectors in this respect. And this needed to be done following the 2008 crisis. It was around that time that we realized that the parameters that were in place in finance, essentially capital accumulation and wealth, that was being done without any rules. And this was essentially broken down, laid bare, and a new approach was taken from that point on. Now, the world is not accustomed to thinking about things in this way. It was accustomed to thinking about things in a different context and in a different way of doing things. So it was essentially in the past something that was based in having donations. So people would give donations, and then that was something related to trying to do good. So this good-doing culture. But there was somewhat of a distance that existed. So here I'm happy to give a charitable donation, and then I'll just leave it at that. So that was a phase that lasted for a certain amount of time. Subsequently, there was another phase when people began to analyze it a little bit more in detail as to what the flip side of that was at. So they started to ask themselves, what type of projects, what type of initiatives do I want to support through my donations? So this was an excellent shift, because it essentially meant that the organizations that were receiving the donations and then the financial institutions were able to be more systematic in the approach to it. And when it came to financial institutions, what we saw was that there were a number of different initiatives in terms of CSR, social impact. And so the process to adopt a new cultural approach to this began. There was a different way of couching the subject when we started to talk about the third sector, and we started to begin to discuss the issue of assistance in a different way. I listened with interest to some of the comments that have been brought forth over the course of the last 2 days, and I think that we have now moved on to even another phase that has a level of sophistication that the previous didn't. And they essentially were looking at how we could come up with new financial tools that are tailor-made to the need of the project and finding a way to be able to measure them. So the third phase will be, how are we able to measure the social impact of the activity, not only on behalf of the association that is carrying out the project, but also on the side of the financial entity that is funding it or assisting in the funding. So this gave a heightened level of professionalism to the financing of social efforts. much of this comes from the Anglo-Saxon world, but of course we're now getting on board. And of course there's the issue of how can you get access to financing for these social projects, because of course it can't just be an economic consideration. It cannot just be dependent on donations, but also there has to be a structural link to the financial world as well. In some parts of the Anglo-Saxon world, there can be bonds, to simplify here, bonds that are linked to certain benchmarks, social benchmarks in this case. To give an example, if someone used to be in prison and is no longer and is able to remain out of prison, or it could be linked to school benchmarks, a group of students that come from an underprivileged neighborhood or context, if they're able to do something. So a really impact bonds, these are called, so something that touches on very concrete things that you can measure. We haven't gotten there yet in Italy. We're more or less in the second phase that I spoke of, where there is a careful selection in flanking the institutions to try to find the best possible assurance as to what they're doing. So San Petriano is a great example of that. And so then we try to assist in those types of endeavors, but we haven't moved on yet to that third phase that I spoke of. How long do you think it will be for us to move on to that third phase, in your opinion? Well, we all want to move there. That's what we're aiming for. But what we need now is to be able to certify the results of something. To give you an example, if you come up with a bond and the yield on that bond or the payback on that bond is linked to some sort of a benchmark or an achievement. I gave you the example of people, for example, who were in prison and that would know they come back into society and then they do not go back into prison. That would be, for example, an objective. We have to be able to verify if that this is done. And here you're going to need an outsider to be able to verify this result. They have to be transparent and accountable. And we need to be able to choose this third person who's going to be verifying. Could be an NGO, could be an authority, a region, a municipality, but whatever the case may be, it has to be a third party. We're not taking away from that body, because the minute we start talking about a third party, we get nervous about what that means. What we're trying to do is really give a credibility to it. So once we've found this certifying body, let's call it, for lack of a better term, I don't see why we wouldn't be able to immediately move into that third phase, but it's something that we're going to have to be able to measure without a doubt. So in your experience, Sarah, at Deutsche Bank, what can you give us in terms of a contribution on that? We have done some things. We've been a part of the first phase where there was a big windfall. And now we're in phase 2. We've made a selection of 4 or 5 partners, let's call them. They are partners, and San Petriano is one of those partners, where we feel very comfortable in our interactions. We're able to suggest co-investment to them or different types of projects to undertake, and that are then able to be fleshed out by our partners. We haven't moved yet to the third phase, nor have we been able to begin the phase in which we come up with our own projects. We're still allowing others to carry out those projects. So by way of example, San Petriano, as one of our partners, would be in charge of driving the project. And we're not yet doing them ourselves. I'm not sure if we will one day do that. But to give you an illustration, in Germany, there are professional schools or vocational training schools in the hotel industry and young people from underprivileged neighborhoods or contexts that are assisted in going to the school. There are grants. They're given training within the Deutsche Bank, and then Deutsche Bank assists them in finding in employment, so specifically in the hospitality sector and hotels. So this is something that we are assisting and doing, and that we're in charge of. We're assisting in this, but we're looking to continue our assistance, but we have yet to spearhead projects, and so our assistance consists in essentially providing the money, making sure that it is used correctly. So it's a second level support, if you will, not first level support, if we could refer to it as that. We had a chance to talk about certification previously, so that we need a body that can validate the results of a project. So that will be needed, but perhaps the way of banking needs to change fundamentally. Well, if you don't mind, I would say that it is changing. I know that someone is going to be taking the floor briefly from Banca Prossima. We have provided bonds, for example, last year for a food bank. They needed something in particular, and we were able to admit those bonds. So I think that the approach has changed. The financial world is changing its approach to the nonprofit sector. It's a bit schizophrenic still, I think. Everyone is sort of doing as they please. There's Banca Prossima, for example. We have our performance bonds and social bonds, rather, the speaker corrects themselves, that are to the benefit of some people. So they changed their approach to socialization. So in terms of organization, it's structured differently, but we can see that there's something exceptional in Italy. Many people work as volunteers, and they support that. And so they don't just talk, they actually walk the walk. So we have the raw materials. People are wonderful in what they're doing. In Milan, where there's very careful attention being paid to volunteer work, and there are a lot that are working, and a lot of bodies working with volunteer. Now, just recently, a big multinational from nonprofit from the Anglo-Saxon world came to see me to see if the Deutsche Bank would be interested in what they were doing. And the thing that really struck me was that for the first time, what they did was they purchased a nonprofit from Arezzo here in Italy. So they acquired a network in Arezzo, an NGO. In fact, this nonprofit in Arezzo was very good at handling a specific aspect that the multinational was interested in. So how curious to see what the Italians are good at doing and that are perhaps not organized, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, comes a foreign country that understands it immediately. So that's quite particular. So you are the head of a company here in Italy of a specific international reality that comes to us from Germany, Deutsche Bank, of course. So what could you tell me as to the differences that exist between Germany and Italy? And could you make a comparison for me between Italy and Germany, especially as pertains to this subject? Well, I think that we have been able to learn from our branches in Germany and in England. We've been able to learn about how things are changing and how people are able to support the world of volunteer work, and to learn from them, to see how they work. From our point of view, what I would say is that we have this participation of employees in Deutsche Bank, and they can use their hours for volunteer work. And we see that it's actually that our contribution to that by our employees is better in Italy than it is in England or Germany. So by way of an example, 1 day a month for volunteer work. It's organized differently depending on the entity. And then this would be recognized not as a day of vacation that has been taken by the employee, but rather as a day that has been worked. And we see that people are doing it more in Italy than they are in Great Britain or in Germany. And I think that that is a very positive sign. So Deutsche Bank in Italy is based on this volunteer, or it has this foundation of volunteer work of its employees. So as a SPA, or a company based on actions, in Deutsche Bank we look for finance for we have a foundation that we finance, that we seek that money for our foundation, and then we request of our employees to, on a voluntary basis, take part in activities for our partners that are carrying out activities in Milan or elsewhere. So it's not just financing our partners, but it's also something that we are doing in terms of making our employees a part of the entire process and working together. So this very important twofold approach. Of course, we don't expect our employees to work. We don't require them to do something. We don't have to expect that from them because they do it on their own accord. And so I think it's very important, these two things that are combined in terms of approach. So what types of objectives have you set for yourself? Well, as of the foundation was launched in 2013, what are your objectives? The objectives are to continue to fine-tune the concept that we are still working on, the second phase that I spoke of. So those 3 or 4 excellent partners with whom we are working and that we are so pleased to support, and with whom we work together very congenially, San Petriano being one. So 3 or 4 situations that we are supporting in a very stable way. We feel comfortable with that, and we feel very comfortable with San Petriano, and we are very honored to be a partner of this community. We will continue to do that for the next 2 or 3 years. We have our standards and our requests, of course, and we are somewhat set in our ways, and we plan to be so for 2 or 3 years' time. Then we're going to be looking at the structures for certification that I spoke of previously, see how they are taking form. They're getting up and running in Italy, also in part because of the awareness raising that has been done by the government. Letizia was a part of that. She piloted the G8, social G8. So they were trying to decipher what the best practices were in Europe, and then to be able to bring them and graft them here in Italy. So we're really aiming to see how this measurement concept is going to take root, and then from there on, and what we see is it currently works in Great Britain for the time being, and hopefully Deutsche Bank will be the first to pick it up here in Italy, and that we would be very proud of if it were the case. So as a VP and as a part of one of the 5 VPs, as the head of Deutsche Bank here in Italy, let's take a systemic point of view when it comes to your operations, or your MO. Is the banking system prepared to be able to support this third phase that you've laid out for us in terms of the cultural change that might be needed for that? Let us say that the banking system is at different phases of development as pertains to that. Some are farther ahead, some are less prepared. The church campaign, for example, which is fine, and thank goodness that exists. Usually the banks that support that are regional banks or provincial banks. And that is a support that would work well for that, perhaps. And then big institutions might have the responsibility to move forward this social aspect within the banking community. There are various approaches to that. Banca Intesa and Banca Prossima, which is a bank that loans money to nonprofit. Unicredit has match giving as well, on the basis, if I'm not mistaken, of on a digital basis. We've taken a different approach to that, but the main financial institutions are trying to accompany this approach as best we can to support social efforts. There are 600 banks, and there's a bit of everything. So you get it's a mixed bag, really. And I think that you need the small banks for the small communities, and then you need the bigger banks to be able to push things down the line a little bit more and drive it. And of course, keeping in mind that we have to be able to make that profitable. So what type of so there are going to be decision makers that are going to have an effect on the economic and social aspects. What do we need, in your opinion, to be able to really, how could I put this, to make this third phase possible? How can we make it something that will become a reality? Well, the certification is going to be tantamount. A lot of things are being discussed, and I think that we're moving out of the period of recession, so hopefully we'll be able to take a more optimistic view of things, meaning that we might be able to feel less pressure, less anxiety as to the recession. So recession is behind us. This is our chance now, and many people are beginning to really turn to the government, promote this, and we need to somehow make sure it takes concrete form. But there are people that are working very hard and working towards that, and I do believe it will happen.